I'm 80 years old, I'm going to deliver this sitting down. And I also am not going to use the mic. Yes, I think you can hear me. Can't you?
Can you hear?
Yeah, you can hear me. Everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
It's a small group here. This building was built before modern microphones. And in fact, the building, this particular room, was built for just speaking. Okay. And in fact, I have a history with this room because I was a intern for Senator Birch Bayh in 1967. And I heard that Robert F. Kennedy, yes, the original Robert F. Kennedy, was going to announce for president. And he was going to announce in this room. So I came down to see if I could, sit in on his announcement. And at the door they said, oh, no, it's only press. And I said, well, I'm a reporter for the Oberlin Review, our city newspaper. And they said, oh, okay. So they let me in. And so I got to sit in the front row with Bobby Kennedy and I was for president. And just a few weeks later, my brother came to visit. We went to his office and asked, if he could, my brother and I could just shake hands with him. Bobby came up. And he didn't just shake hands with us, he invited us into his office, and he spent an hour talking to my brother and me, two college students. That is the kind of man he was. I wish we had leaders like him again. I am really honored to be able to speak with you today about a country I care so deeply about. Ethiopia is the birthplace of humanity. The oldest ancestor of humanity, Homo sapiens, dates back 4.2 million years, and that remains found in Ethiopia. From 100 AD, the Kingdom of Aksum established a unified civilization for over 900 years, while Europeans were still wandering around in animal skins and clubs and killing animals. After Armenia, Ethiopia was the world's second Christian kingdom in 324 AD. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity became the official state religion. The Solomonic dynasty, from which the kings and emperors came, was largely ruled by Amharas. In 1866, Menelik II reestablished the Ethiopian Empire and expanded the empire. Unfortunately, Ethiopia has been divided between 80 ethnic groups for over 200 years. Ethiopia's history of ethnic conflict has prevented Ethiopia from having the peace and the security that it deserves. Every ethnic has suffered from discrimination, persecution, and genocide. Italian colonialism worsened the divisions, especially between Eritrea and the rest of Ethiopia. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1895, but Ethiopia defeated Italy in the Battle of Adwa in the 1st of March 1896, and Ethiopia was recognized as a sovereign independent nation by European powers, the first African independent nation. Ethiopia lost its sovereignty in 1936 when Mussolini's fascists invaded, but it was restored in 1944 after Italy was defeated in World War II. And October 24th, 1945, Ethiopia became a founding member of the United Nations, the first nation in Africa to be a member of the United Nations. Haile Selassie became Ras, the regent, in 1916 and emperor in 1930. Emulating Japan in 1931, Haile Selassie decreed Ethiopia's first constitution, a monarchist constitution. And in 1955, the Constitution was revised us to make Ethiopia a constitutional monarch. Now, today I would like to talk to you about the challenge of Ethiopian constitutionalism, because the key thing that we need to talk about right now is how Ethiopia must have a new constitution. And I've helped write constitutions. I helped write the new Ukrainian post-Soviet constitution. I helped to write the new South African constitution after majority rule. So I know how important constitutions are, and I taught constitutional law. This constitution that Ethiopia now has today was imposed by the Tigrayan regime in 1995. So what we now have is a constitution that no longer fits Ethiopia. In fact, I think with good justification, one could say that the writers of the 1995 Constitution, largely the Tigrayans, wrote it so that they would have particular advantage if they decided to secede from Ethiopia. And as you know, they're right at the edge of Eritrea, so it is a real possibility. In 1974, the Mengistu regime took power, a communist regime, a Soviet-backed communist regime. And from 1976 to 78, up to 500,000 Ethiopians were murdered in the Red Terror. The first genuine genocide in Ethiopian history. The Derg imposed the 1987 Constitution, which was simply a version of the 1977 Soviet Constitution. Democratic centralism was the doctrine. But what it did is it concentrated dictatorial power in Mengistu and the Workers' Party, the Communist Party. All private property was abolished and made state property. During the Derg era, arbitrary arrest, torture, and execution ran rampant. And in 1983 to 85, a famine affected over 8 million people and resulted in 1 million dead people. The Soviet Union finally fell in 1989 to 1991. I was part of that too, because I was the legal advisor to the Ukrainian independence movement. And they asked me, Professor Stan, what should we do? I said, you should adopt the tactics of the American Civil Rights Movement. Nonviolent resistance. But you're going to have to teach people what that means, because we will be met with violence. And so we literally trained Ukrainians to not respond to clubs with violence, but instead with nonviolence. And we also had this sort of what could I call it, a tactic that really worked. We started going down to the prison where they were holding a number of the independence leaders, including Stefan Kamara. And the column marched down from the Maidan, the center of Kyiv. We had women, beautiful Ukrainian women, dressed to the nines with flowers on the outside. And they were on the Soviet, the KGB was along the line all the way down the way with their balaclava masks. They looked a bit like ice agents, frankly. And their clubs and all this. Were they going to attack these ladies? I don't think so. And right inside, we also then had these huge Russian-speaking Ukrainian miners from eastern Ukraine. Great big guys that looked like they all had black belts, And I think that the Oman might have just thought twice about attacking them as well. And then the rest of us cowards just walked down the middle of the line. And we walked to this prison. We did it every Friday. And then we'd come back. They wouldn't let us in, of course. And then we'd come back and have a huge rally in Central Square of Kyiv. And I spoke at those rallies. Except, of course, I didn't speak Ukrainian. So I would write write a speech. And the head of the Ukrainian independence movement was the best poet in Ukraine. He also spoke English. I'd hand the speech over to him and translate it into poetry. And of course, that meant to people just went wild. The one time when I did speak in English, it really didn't need translation, was when I went to the American consulate there and asked if they had a copy of the Declaration of Independence in Ukrainian. And of course they did. I just read the first 3 paragraphs of the American Declaration of Independence in Ukrainian to the audience. 5,000 people. And they cheered for 15 minutes. Those words are just as revolutionary today as they were. And even though our own nation, the United States, has not lived up to all that was set forth in terms of human rights that were put forward by Jefferson in that remarkable document, even though we didn't live up to and still are not living up to the equality of all people. And by the way, in that document, we talk about all men are created equal. Well, that kind of leaves out half the human rights stuff. But we've come a long way on that too, because one of my ancestors was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the founders of the American Suffrage Movement here in the United States. She was at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And when she got up to announce that women should have the right to vote, her husband, Henry Brewster Stanton, vice president of the World Anti-Slavery League, thought it was such a radical idea, he walked out of the Seneca Falls meeting. She brought it around, by the way. She brought it around. But that is while our country has gradually increased the scope of the liberties that are protected by our Constitution to include all people in America. The question I have now is, are we going to be able to hold those freedoms? Because I think right now we're in the grip of a regime that is white racist, that is, in fact, I believe, almost Nazi. And when we were sending ICE agents around to arrest people who come here seeking asylum or immigration, I believe we are violating the basic principles of our own country's Constitution. Well, that kind of ethnic and racial distinction is what has cursed mankind from the beginning of time. We are born to be ethnocentric because we're born into a certain culture with a certain language. And that culture becomes what we think is ultimate. We believe that if leaders can convince us that our culture is somehow superior to everybody else's, it results then in racism, in ethnocentrism, and eventually genocide. And that's what, of course, Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide is determined to stop. So how do we stop it in Ethiopia? Because Ethiopia has been cursed with these ethnic divisions for at least 200 years. Well, the Tigray People's Liberation Front made things even worse. They overthrew the Derg communist regime, which is a very important thing to do, May 1991. But then they took power and they appointed Tigrayans to run the government. And then they committed genocide against Anuaks, Oromos, Ogadenis, Amhars, you name it. They committed one genocide after another. The reason I know it was because in 2003, Obama Meto, who, by the way, is, he founded the movement for a new Ethiopia, called me up from Saskatchewan, where he had gone to live, and said, did you know, this is December 10th, 2003, did you know that Highlanders and the Ethiopian Defense Forces had just massacred 484 Anuak in Gambela City? I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, I've called the State Department, I've called the embassy, I've called Human Rights Watch. They said, we don't have anybody there. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, I did had just left the State Department, and I knew the desk officer for Ethiopia. His name is Gonzalez. I called him up at night at his home, and I said, "Did you know this has happened?" He said, "No, I didn't know this." I said, and I had corroborated, by the way. I got phone numbers and I called the governor, who was himself an Iowa. I called others who could corroborate that this had happened. And then I called Gonzalez, and I said, "Could you call our ambassador out there, Oriol Braziel, one of these rare ambassadors who could actually think outside the box, and go ask her to please march into Prime Minister Melis's office and tell her to stop this genocide?" And she did. And they did. They stopped. They'd already killed 1,000 people. And many had fled into Pochala refugee camp out of Sudan. Just a few months later, I got a satellite phone call from Pochala camp saying the Ethiopian Defense Forces are 20 kilometers away. They're going to invade the camp tomorrow. I said, he said, because they want to force us to go back to Ethiopia. Again, I called Mr. Gonzalez. I said, "Please get Ambassador Braziel to again walk into Melis's office and tell him to get his troops out of Sudan. It's a violation of international law." And they left. They left. So it's this is the sort of really quick action sometimes you need to do if you're going to prevent genocide. And we've done that in many other ways, in other countries, in other situations. Cote d'Ivoire is another one where we directly intervened. Another was East Timor, where we've actually managed to stop genocides. The idea, of course, is not to just stop them, is to prevent them. Because, and I have set up 2 international tribunals, the one for Rwanda and the one for Cambodia. And what I learned from that is, if you have to set up a tribunal, it's too late. You have to prevent genocide. Well, that's what a new constitution for Ethiopia needs to do. So let's take a look at what we need to do if we're going to stop genocide in Ethiopia. We need to write a new constitution that will really be a constitution that people can believe in, and that will unify Ethiopia the way it once was under the Haile Selassie regime and for 900 years under the Oxum Empire. To do that, we have to overcome the weaknesses in the 1995 Constitution. I want to just enumerate some. The 1995 Constitution is rooted in Marxist, democratic, centralist thinking. That really means dictatorship. And ethnic self-determination is present throughout the Constitution. It is not framed as a constitution for all Ethiopians. It's confederal rather than federal. It allows for actual collective secession and so forth by separate ethnic groups. Regional governments are given the same overlapping powers as the federal government. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, the various powers of states and the federal government are not distinguished clearly. So what can we do to overcome that weakness? The Article 39 in the 1995 Constitution actually formalizes this ethnic separatism. The Constitution, first of all, allows ethnic states to have their own militias. Now, that is, of course, a recipe for genocide. Because if ethnic states can have their own militias, then they can conduct genocide against minorities within those states. The national sovereignty is not reserved to the federal government in the 1995 Constitution because it allows for these militias. state militias. This is not normal national federalism. In the European Union, for instance, each member state has its own armed forces, but it doesn't allow the regions of each state to have their armed forces. In the UK, the various parts of the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they're not sovereign. They do not have their own armies. Constitutions that permit constituent states to have their own armed forces are really confederations of independent states rather than parts of a single sovereign nation. That was the weakness in our own American Articles of Confederation, which permitted each state to have its own armed force and gave each state the right to regulate commerce, trade, tariffs, and all these other ways of obstructing true national government. Well, America's founding fathers, and I have to say, before the women here, they were fathers, only fathers, but they realized that America needed a new, truly federal constitution. And so in 1787, they wrote a new constitution. And in 1788, they ratified it and threw out the old Articles of Confederation. Now, the U.S. Constitution grants the powers to the federal government that are specifically enumerated. The federal government can regulate interstate commerce, levy tariffs and federal taxes, raise armed forces, conduct foreign affairs, make treaties, appoint ambassadors and federal judges, create federal courts, pass and enforce federal laws, and declare and wage war. Those are exclusive powers. Only the federal government can do those things. The supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution states, and I'm quoting, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." In other words, even if a state makes a law that is contrary to a federal law, that state law must fall. It is not to be enforced. Now, James Madison, who is the principal author of the U.S. Constitution, said that by ratifying the Constitution, states had transformed their sovereignty to the federal government. Article 10, in fact, of the U.S. Constitution reserves these non-enumerated powers in the Constitution to the states. But the supremacy clause means that when federal law conflicts with state law, federal law prevails. So what do we have here with the 1995 Ethiopian Constitution? Well, Article 39 grants the unconditional right to self-determination, including the right to secession. What? This is a feature almost never seen in national constitutions. Unlike constitutions of true federal nation states, such as the United States, India, Germany, where ultimate legal sovereignty rests with the sovereign nation state, this still leaves some sovereignty in every state. And the danger of state secession is best illustrated by our own Civil War here in the United States. Southern slave states asserted their right to secede from the Union, a power that was not granted to them by the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. government had to muster a huge army, a Union army, to preserve the Union. And the American Civil War was the result. The American Civil War cost 600,000 lives. More lives were lost in our American Civil War than in all the other wars that we've been in combined. The regional hatreds of that Civil War still divide America. And we're still trying to overcome the legacy of slavery. So it took 100 years after the Civil War to finally give African Americans the right to vote and prohibit discrimination based on race. Again, I have a very personal understanding of that because I was a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1966, a voting rights worker. It was after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been passed, it sent federal registrars down to these states to register voters. I was part of a civil rights group that went to pick up African American voters and take them down to the registry. And we drove down to Edgewater, Ohio, where I voted ballot. And what we found there was terrorism. Because we would go around and pick up a voter who stayed with families, African American families. So we go to pick up voters to register. And we were followed by the Ku Klux Klan. This is in a city of the Mississippi town of Carthage, which is just a few miles down the road from Philadelphia, where they had just murdered 3 civil rights movements. They not only did that, they shot up our house one night. They, shot up with shotguns for people. And a few of my friends were wounded up in the front room. I was in the back, making supper or something. And what we saw, in other words, was terrorism. Ku Klux Klan terrorism. When people ask me where's the most dangerous place you've ever worked, and I have worked in Rwanda before and after the genocide. I've worked in Cambodia after the genocide. I've worked in Iraq when ISIS still held parts of western Iraq, drove within a mile of the Muslim dam where they held the other side. I have been in all those places, but Mississippi in 1966 is still the most dangerous place I've ever been. The only place I've ever been shot at. Now the Ethiopian government realizes that it needs a new constitution. And so it's appointed a commission to write a new constitution. The question is, how is that commission doing so far? Well, unfortunately, it is not moving very fast. And it appears that little discussion has been really put on some of the lessons from federalism in other countries, including the lesson here, where we realized a confederation wasn't enough. And so the question then is, what recommendations would I make, and Genocide make, for the Ethiopian Constitution? The reality is that Ethiopian constitutional politics should not be ethnically based. Power must flow from the center in a federal government, and the states, the ethnic states, as they're now constituted, must be beneath that power. The greatest failure, though, is not simply that these ethnic states exist. It is that the perception among, especially a lot of other ethnic groups, is that this 1995 Constitution was written by the Greys for their own benefit, and therefore it is hostility and distrust. And for a Constitution to have an effect, it has to be a Constitution that is respected by the people. Democracy is based on consent. Without consent, democracy cannot survive. People must not just be told by the police that they must obey the law in the Constitution. They must accept their own responsibility to obey the law in the Constitution. That is the kind of Constitution that Ethiopia needs today. It must be seen as representing all ethnic groups that have woven this rich, many-colored cultural tapestry of Ethiopia. It's not enough that these ethnic groups are consulted. They must be seen and widely accepted that they have all had their say. Only this will produce an Ethiopia in which no ethnic group considers that the nation's political structure is designed to benefit only them and not others. The question is, can Ethiopia function as a true federation? Some say the cultural differences between the nationalities are just too great, that each of these ethnic groups has different traditions, different cultures, different identities, and different allegiances. Some say that Ethiopia is really not going to ever be a nation, It was a nation for over 900 years, and then even beyond that. So we know that's false. But unfortunately, under the 1995 Constitution, Ethiopia has been plagued by wars and genocides. And now it has again, that ugly head of genocide and ethnic violence has again come Ethiopia. So this must be a constitution that will prevent civil war and genocide. So what's required? First, the Constitution must not be adopted by a government that is mistrusted by any major ethnic groups in Ethiopia. It must not be drafted or be seen to be advantageous for any single ethnic group. If a constitution is adopted by a government that's perceived as partial to only one ethnic group, it won't be trusted. It won't be consented to. It won't be considered legitimate. Second, the new constitution must not take Ethiopian unity for granted. The federal government must be strong enough to keep it from falling apart. It must not create pathways for separatism or ethnic divisions. It must create a federal government strong enough to overcome the centrifugal forces that are created by domination by ethnically dominated states. Now, Madison knew that for the U.S. and in a country like Ethiopia, with a history of ethnic and racial disparity, a strong, unified federal government is necessary. But it must also have a Bill of Rights to protect minorities, to protect individuals against all powerful, even powerful federal governments that might try to take away those rights. It must have an independent judiciary that can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. Right now, the 1995 Constitution does not give judicial review to the judiciary. It only allows laws to be struck down by one of the chambers of the parliament, the upper chamber of the parliament. In other words, politics comes directly into those decisions. We need an independent judiciary in Ethiopia. Third, the Constitution must clearly define the powers of the federal government and the residual powers of state governments. It must distinguish between citizenship in the Ethiopian nation and in Ethiopia's states. Deciding the distribution of powers will be difficult, but if Ethiopia is to avoid civil wars, Ethiopians must agree on the roles of the federal and state governments, then strictly write them into the new constitution and respect and abide by those differentiations of power. So the Constitution of 1995 will continue to produce civil wars and ethnic genocides. Those who want a strong Ethiopian federal nation in which Ethiopians are citizens of Ethiopia first and members of their ethnic group second, the 1995 Constitution must be scrapped and rewritten. Ethiopia must decide whether to be a nation with a central autocracy or a true federation. So, if one ethnic group tries to again impose its interests on the country as a whole, the next constitution will also fail. What we need is a non-ethnic constitution in Ethiopia. We need a united Ethiopia. We need a federal Ethiopia, a really federal Ethiopia that functions well and that guarantees unity. I'll close with these words from the great Ethiopian philosopher Waldo Kaiser. Do not believe the doctrine of fools who say that our fellow man means only our relatives or our friends. Do not say what they do. For all men and women are fellow men and women.